Welcome back. Today's lesson will be on pivoting. We're going to be concentrating on two patterns, our bow tie pattern, and it's this angle, which is, of course, a little more than a 90-degree angle, that we'll be working on. This, of course, is a block getting ready to go into a quilt. Here it is, finished in a bow tie pattern with a double ruffle that has been turned into a big pillow. The same idea will be done with our formal garden pattern. These are two blocks that Barbara Jane has done, probably getting ready to go into a tote bag. But this is the angle that we'll be pivoting. And we'll learn about that and how the pattern is made when we get to the sewing machine. We'll end our show with an array of pillows, many different varieties, different techniques and ways to add accent to your home. I want to point out a lovely sampler quilt, very bright and cheerful, that Betty Snyder has done. And of course, if we look closely, we can find the two blocks we'll be working on today. Here is our mini bow tie pattern. I've heard this called True Lover's Knot, and it's also been referred to as a magic circle. And then, of course, at the very bottom, we have our formal garden pattern. She's been very clever. Her last name is Snyder, and she's, in her parallelogram here, she's just hand scrolled an S, so she's got has a way to identify her quilt. Let's go into our working room. Let's refresh our memory just a minute with some of the work that we've already learned. Also, take a few minutes to examine the templates, and I want to mention that in order to protect and more or less keep your templates after you've glued them on the poster board and have a nice firm weighted cardboard, I think that you'll find your firm edge will last longer. I like to take some clear contact paper, the sort that you'd get at a hardware store, and place over the entire sheet before I would cut out each pattern. And it does preserve and keep your patterns a lot longer. A good hint for you might be to keep your patterns in a notebook of some sort. This keeps them in order. I keep the 4 patches in one section and the 9 patches in another. Also, there is on the market a new kind of plastic out that I believe it's called a rough and ready type plastic that doesn't move around on one side but is clear through, and you can see enough that it would be nice in using these as templates because you could see your prints through. And if you wanted to keep your booklet in order, you could simply place the plastic on and, of course, using a ruler, transfer your designs and your exact measurement onto the plastic. I'd use an ink that would not run or that is not water soluble. One that you'd use to mark in a freezer tape is nice to use. Let's take a few minutes to remember some of our patterns we've worked on. How about just a basic 4-patch? For some of you, of course, that have been advanced and gone a little bit further, this might seem very preliminary, but I think it's a good beginning. In this case, we've worked with 4 different shades of muslin. And in order to make this more important block, we've gone ahead and placed an intricate stencil pattern on there. And it turns out to be a very important block once it's quilted. Also, in our basic 4-patch, it's a good place if you're making a memory quilt to take and perhaps put your child's hand on 2 opposite blocks and then maybe doing some embroidery work, the date that you finished the quilt or the day the baby was born, something on that order. That's with your, of course, your basic 4-patch, your 6.5-inch square. From there, let's remember about a double 4-patch, which would use your same 6.5-inch square and then also would borrow the square from your star flower pattern. Remember how we kept our seams closed. When you open them, it simply weakens your quilt and makes it more vulnerable. You can see what would happen if you would be pulling that open. So we keep our seams closed. We make sure and stagger our seams when possible. Have one seam going in the opposite direction. This one's going this way. That enables you to get a nice melding there in the middle. And of course, quite often that's the first thing we'll look at in a block, is to see how your intersections have come together. In this case, 2 prints, 4 dark of the small square and 4 light calicos, and you have a 12.5-inch square. Let's remember our basic 4-patch in the rail fence, 16 pattern pieces. Remember, the more pattern pieces you get, the more important, of course, it is that all of these are cut out correctly. Basic 4-patch, so we would be putting it together in this fashion, alternating your stripes, and of course you might come out with a new version. It's nice to press all your seams back on this block. This one needs to be pressed all the way back. And I believe this one has been pressed back. It makes it nice when you're quilting. You don't have those 3 layers to quilt through. That would be your rail fence. Let's remember the King's X, 2 pattern pieces. And here we have a study, more or less in navy blue and white. And I have one that has not been sewn together all the way. Remember that it's a basic 4-patch, and that you are going to get some triangles when you sew the triangle to this figure. Let those hang off in an even arrangement. A little bit of triangle on each side. We call those dog ears, remember? And once they hang off, you can trim those off with some scissors. If those bother you, go ahead and just trim them off if they get in your way. And that way you can line up that seam. You want to make sure you'll have 3 pins when you sew this half to this half. Right here, here, and here. Remember, from our raw edge into this triangular point, we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We need that, don't we, to put one seam to the next. That was our King's X pattern. Now the pinwheel pattern, many different arrangements out of just one triangle. And in this case, we have 2 different prints, for a small print and for a larger print. And the same idea, using the pinwheel, but a broken dishes pattern. In this case, we've used more or less a waffle cotton, and the new eyelet's very nice. It has an eyelet look, but yet there are no holes in that, and that's nice for quilting because then your batting won't come through. Let's also remember our star flower pattern uses the square and also a triangle. Now there are a few more pattern pieces in this one, but you get a very interesting look and truly a star pattern without using diamonds. Diamonds are for a more advanced work in quilting, but the whole idea here is that it is a basic 4-patch and that 12 times these triangles will be sewn together to form a square, 3 in each corner. And when those are sewn together, then this one will be sewn to this, and then your square to this set. Remember how important it is, once again, to stagger your seams. And when it's eaten up, you're going to have that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure and take your time putting this one together so you've alternated. You have your eyelet and your solid, eyelet and solid, and when, of course, this is formed together, you have your star flower pattern. Let's take a look at what I call a white-on-white quilt. And it almost has a wedding look to it, and it's a feminine quilt, but it's an idea of using all solid colors. In this case, it was a potpourri of leftover muslin fabrics, and I used eyelet in the borders and then put a ruffle around the outside. And I think it has a wedding look and is soft and feminine. It would be something to do with any solid color fabric. Another quilt that I'm quite proud of, one of my students, B. Warren, this is actually her 2nd quilt, but it's an idea for you of taking one pattern, in this case it was the star flower pattern, and repeating it, the same pattern, in each block. She's used an array of maroon and navy blue, and I think has come up with a lovely, lovely quilt. Keep in mind that a cookie cutter, simple things that you might find in your house, make nice stencil patterns to follow. And in this case, if you can follow very, very tight here and see how the heart design has simply been a heart cookie cutter centered in the middle, and then one side of it becomes the feather look around each side. I think her choice of colors are just lovely, and then to enlarge her quilt she has put a border all the way around the outside, 2 colors of border. Underneath we have B's first quilt. Now this is hard to imagine. I call this an Americana touch, but it is just a beautiful quilt, all solid colors, red, white, and blue, in all of our sampler patterns, and many she has improvised and borrowed one pattern from another. Look at this marvelous 9-patch in the center, 81 tiny squares in this square, a true test of patience. Let's turn to our formal garden and our bow tie and examine exactly how those are made. I have a little logo for you to pass on to your family when your sewing room is gotten out of hand. Creative clutter is better than idle neatness. Let's refresh our memory with the fact that when we're making patterns, we want to draw a square. the exact size of our finished block. In this case, we're working with 12-inch squares, so I have already drawn a 12-inch square. In the case of the formal garden, we will be dividing it into quarters. And actually, we're going to end up with 4 triangles, aren't we? And once I have done that, I decide on the center square that I want to use. Now, in this case, I like a 4-inch center square, so I have marked that off with a ruler. So if I know that's 4 inches in the square, I will come down here and measure from the outside edge in 4 inches. And then I'm simply going to connect this line to my center square, and I end up with 4 parallelograms and 4 triangles, right? Now, if I study that pattern, I can figure out I'm going to need 3 pattern pieces. I'll need my triangle, my parallelogram, and my center square. Each one of these, 3 of them, would be cut out. They'd be placed on cardboard and a 1/4-inch seam allowance added on all 4 sides. Well, in this case, the triangle would be 3 sides. And remember, keep in mind that the patterns, the templates in the booklet, the 1/4-inch seam allowance is already included. But you might want to make your own formal garden pattern. Also, let's go down to our bow tie pattern. We think of actually a basic 4-patch in the bow tie. Same idea, 12-inch square. We have divided it into quarters, and then we've decided on a 2.5-inch square in the center here. In this case, we will be cutting this out, and we'll just need 1 center, but we'll add a 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way around, and this pattern will be the other pattern. It'll say cut 2 dark, maybe cut 1 dark center, and then cut 2 light. That will become our pattern for the bow tie. If we want to get even smaller and break this pattern up into a basic 4-patch, it would mean in that 6-inch square, we would simply be finding a center square that would be on the angle, on the diagonal, and that would then become our true lover's knot or our magic circle. And we would, of course, have 2 pattern pieces here also. Keep in mind when making your own patterns, many of the new rulers have inches on one side and centimeters on the next. So make sure that you're actually adding a 1/4-inch seam allowance on the side if you're making your own patterns. Let's go to the sewing machine and see how these patterns are put together. Once you're at the sewing machine, I think it's a good idea to keep your template with a picture on it of the finished block right close by. It avoids any mistakes happening from the time you go from here to the machine itself. I might also mention that I have come across a nice little implement that you might want to get. You know, we're used to the seam allowance when we're making garments, that 5/8-inch seam allowance, and of course when we go to piecing our patchwork blocks, we're using a 1/4-inch seam allowance. I like to use a masking tape that has been measured from the point of the needle all the way out. And also on the market is a little magnetic edge that will snug right up close, and that would be another way of giving you a good guide from the point of the needle out. Make sure and measure if you're using an all-purpose foot, that is a zigzag foot, make sure and measure that also. It might be wider than your 1/4-inch seam allowance. All right, to put the bow tie together, we want to think of sewing opposites. In other words, I'm going to take my muslin and I'm first going to machine sew the center block to the inside part of my square. 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way down. And when I've gone that far, gotten that one done, come over and take the opposite one. I'm going to attach the opposite side. Now the same thing that happens here we'll be doing on the mini bow tie in just a few minutes. All right, slide this under. 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way down. Keep those raw edges lined up. Now, this is where the pivoting takes place. I like to get rid of my loose threads, knowing that this block is going to fit in one side and this is going to fit on the opposite side. Come back and make sure you're lined up. Put the 2 right sides together, and when you do that, get these lined up just like so. Don't let that happen just as in the drunkard's path, or let that slip down. Line that up, and when you line that up and it's all perfectly lined up, you can come down here and see You've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance, haven't you, that falls over where it's already been sewn. All right, you might want to put a pin in here. It's right down to this point that you're aiming for. That's where you're going to turn and pivot on the machine. Start up here, 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. I'd like to, this seam allowance underneath, let it either go out or go in, one or the other, okay? When you come down, you might want to peek and just kind of see if you're on target. You want to come all the way down so your needle is in the seam underneath. So the bottom part will go one way, and this is going to turn all the way over. When that turns, make sure that you don't have anything overlapping inside. And of course, the needle in that material is what allows you to turn, and then your presser foot goes down again and line this up, raw edges meeting all the way down. And once again, I'm aiming for that seam underneath. When I get to that point, needle in the machine, I lift up, the bottom part swings this way, and this part swings all the way around. And when you do that, line up this so it squares off, even at the corners. You're going to like the way that then goes together. 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. All right. Then we have to open up and see if we're pretty much on target. See, we've got our good angle there. We've come across here, good, and we have another section to fit in the same way. Let's do that once more. I think that'll help you to see exactly how it happens. Come all the way, 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Let's remember, this seam is going out. Let's keep it turned out. This comes all the way down. And when we think we're just about there, we might want to peek and turn. Okay, turn this way. Press your foot back down to hold it in place. All the way. You can just check with that up. Yes, I'm right, ready to go, and turn this around. And then when you've come down, you've got your one bow tie block all put together. Let's finish this one and then turn to what would be called the mini bow tie. And look at the different arrangements for that. There is our bow tie pattern. Of course, pressing will make that rest flat, but I think that gives you the idea. Then, if we wanted to do a mini bow tie pattern, the same idea. Let me pull this up. I have two of them already put together, but I'd like to sew one in place. This kind of has a Christmas look, doesn't it, with our red and green print. In this case, I would go ahead and get my bow tie, the center square, to the red. And if I were doing this in what I refer to as my little mass assembly line, I would do this 4 times, wouldn't I? Take this square, and then I'd pick up this one, and this one, and this one. Of course, I've already gotten those two sewn together, but when you have an opportunity to let something just keep going, it saves time, and of course it saves thread also. I find it goes a little bit faster. All right, I've gotten 2 done. Get rid of your threads, knowing that this piece is going to come and fit on here. I've sewn opposites, knowing that I'm going to pivot that green in place in just a few minutes. All the way down. Same thing here. Pick up the red. No, I can't find my red. Lost a, here's the red. All the way down. Knowing that then I'll be taking, this really looks like a bow tie right now, knowing that this green is going to be pivoted in each place there, and the same bow tie will have the green pivoted over here. I'll do one of these, and then you can see what you're going to end up with is a basic 4-patch. All right. Let me move this out of the way so you can see this pivoting. This is just on a little smaller scale, the same idea, all the way down, and peek underneath when you get to that seam underneath. See the 1/4 inch seam allowance? From that needle out, you have a 1/4 inch. You're then going to turn all the way down. With the needle in the machine, you're going to be turning. Make sure you don't get any overlapping underneath there. And I like to make sure this comes all the way out. See how that's meeting there? I know that I'm getting a a firm angle then. That would give you an idea. And of course we need another green placed in here, but then we have, if this were all put together, let's get rid of some of the threads here, I think it'll give you a better idea. If this were all put together and sewn as a basic 4-patch, it could be quilted and hung more or less as a wreath for Christmas time. Let's look at the formal garden pattern, which is so close to, here are some other arrangements of bow ties, by the way, and in this case it's a study of the blue, another study only with 2 calicos. Don't forget your corduroy. It's hard to quilt corduroy because of the nap, but I think you get some interesting looks with the texture and the calico. The formal garden pattern, of course, has 3 pattern pieces. It has the central square. In this case, I think it's fun to highlight a pattern. I have some a lightweight corduroy that has a cat in the center, so that'll be our central motif there. And then we have calico, and we also have the solid chintz. And they are alternating all the way around. I have them pinned together, and I think that gives you an idea. Keep in mind when you're cutting out your parallelogram, and if you have your fabric, say the 2 right sides together, and you cut out, you're going to cut out 4 altogether, and you're doing it in this fashion with a material that has a right or wrong, you're going to end up with 2 of them going the wrong way. So always cut out 4 separately with the parallelogram. But the same idea would work here also. I'm going to sew the triangle to the parallelogram to put together a trapezoid figure. Okay, and I'll be doing that 4 times. When you do that, let the same amount of dog ear that hangs off down here hang off up here also. I'll show you how nicely that works in just a few minutes. I'm using more or less an off-white thread here. I think it's nice to use, of course, a coordinating thread. You wouldn't be sewing a dark calico block with white thread. I think an off-white or a gray is nice thread to use. 4 times we will come down and do the formal garden. Notice how I'm just sewing continuously. It doesn't hurt to sew on air for a couple of stitches. Same idea here. All the way down. Now, when you've got all 4 of these done, separate them, knowing that then you're ready to put the short side of this figure towards your kitty cat. 2 here and 2 here. And then this will become, let's say this will become your bow tie. That goes to this figure. And when you do that, notice how this lines up. And I want to sew this on one side to give you an idea what happens here. You want to make sure that you end up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once that has been sewn, open this up and make sure from that raw edge into there you have a 1/4 inch. You're going to need that in a few minutes when you sew the rest of it together. Center that and line it up all the way down. Of course, get your raw edges meeting all the way. Check and make sure, rid of your threads. Check and make sure, do I have a 1/4 inch? I don't have quite as much here. I'll have to remember that. Then this figure is going to set in here. And when you do that, line this up so the 2 right sides are together. And I like to have a straight angle all the way down here. 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when you come here, make sure that where that seam has been sewn together is going to cross right over that seam. This is what's going to give you a nice pivot here. All the way down. Needle in the machine, peek and make sure, turn all the way, and don't let that overlap there. Then I'm going to come all the way down to this one. It's right in that crease that I want to turn. All the way, line up my raw edges again. I think it's nice to make sure this is happening over here also. Get your points even. You see how much freedom you get there with that material locked in place once that all the way down. And so you have your formal garden done. The same idea would be for the other pattern. You see how you've come down and you get a true right angle there. And the same thing would happen setting this place in here. And then, of course, here's a formal garden with your calicos all ready to be quilted and layered. Let's take a look at a new idea of treating the edge of a pillow. We, of course, spent time learning how to miter corners, and we will show you mitering again in another lesson. But I think it's nice to know how to put this sort of a treatment on a pillow. It gives kind of an accent square in the corners. And just keep in mind that I like to draw things out on paper. Even in my sewing room, I'll draw, for instance, a 12.5-inch square, and then I'll know that I need to cut out 4 of the brown that are going to be 2.5 inches wide and 12.5 inches long. And then I'll know that I need to cut 4 corners that are 2.5 inches square. By doing that, and after, of course, I have my blocks sewn together, I would sew on each end 1 brown piece. Then I would come over, and on these sides, I would have 2 brown pieces with my square on the end, wouldn't I? Then I would simply, after this had been sewn on, I would simply line this up and pin that all the way down. And then when I got to this end, I would know exactly where to pin this square, wouldn't I? So keep in mind that on something like this, sew your edges first, these 2 edge sides first, then come and sew 1 end onto here and 1 square onto here, and then pin it all the way down here, and this will give you an exact true line. You want this to be happening, of course. You want a true right angle there. Let's take a look at all the other treatments for this pillow. Do you remember these King's X patterns? We had fun having different arrangements of the same pattern, and I've interpreted them all 3 in a different pillow technique. One of them would mean going ahead and, of course, adding a border onto your block and quilting it. In this case, I've added alternating the brown and the white border, and then simply putting a straight back on the back side, and then either by machine or by hand you can use an eyelet, what we call insertion, that has been added all the way around the envelope part of your pillow. Then I've added some eyelet on that, and you can take some brown velvet ribbon and intertwine that in your eyelet, and you get a very fancy feminine look from one version of your King's X. Basically, what I like to do on the back side of all of my pillows is to use the sham idea, and I think we remember how that is done. That measurement's given in your book. I believe it's 13.5 inches by 18.5, and it's just a matter of placing the 2 right sides together, and of course you have trimmed this, and you've also sewn a border, and then you're going to machine sew all the way on the back side so that in each case you can simply open up your pillow and wash it readily. In this case, I have put some piping around the outside. Don't forget when you use piping and add bias edging that you make sure and use your zipper foot. That helps you get in real close. We have run out of time today, not enough to cover all of our pillows, so we will just simply pick up on pillows next time, and then we're going to turn to applique. Quite often people want to know, do I hide my knots when I quilt my pillows? I always say, if you're giving this pillow to Aunt Mary, who's been quilting for 20 years, you hide your knots. Otherwise, remember, you really don't need to hide your knots.
To receive a copy of Georgia's Guide to Lap Quilting, simply send $5 to Lap Quilting, Post Office Box 96, Flat Rock, North Carolina 28731.